Hello everyone, welcome to our second online class on divorce. Today I will mostly be highlighting some information from today's reading, which I understand was a bit dense and complicated, so I'm just going to highlight some of the important parts. As usual, we will start class with some objectives. So today's objectives, we're going to talk about what it means that stepfamilies are incompletely institutionalized, and also look at some examples. Explain why second or higher order marriages are less stable, according to the research. Describe how the status of stepparents is ambiguous. And last, identify some areas of research regarding stepfamilies that are underdeveloped. And at the end of today's lecture, I'll also give you a chance to review these objectives. So first I just want to show you some data from Pew Research that just gives us a sense of how common it is for people to have any sort of step relatives in the US. So this is data from 2010 that about 42% of US adults have at least one step relative. Many people have a step or half sibling or a living step parent. And then, interestingly enough, they were only asked of people that have ever been married if they have a stepchild, and that was 13%. From the reading, it seems like, especially somewhat in the US, but also from Europe, there's research on that people don't necessarily have to be married. They could be in a long-term cohabitation relationship and also have a stepchild, or at least somebody that is considered a stepchild. But in this case, they were just looking at people who were married. Okay, so a number of points in the article talked about this idea of uncertain expectations within stepfamilies, and also this idea of stepfamilies being incompletely institutionalized. And by that we mean that there's not necessarily a sort of a clear set of norms of how stepfamilies should behave, how stepparents should behave towards children, and vice versa, but also that stepfamilies are not fully integrated into other social institutions in the US. And as you recall from a few weeks ago when we talked about marriage, we talked about deinstitutionalization. And deinstitutionalization is the weakening of social norms that define people's behavior. And there's definitely some parallels here that it's not really clear what are the social norms regarding stepfamilies, and that families have to negotiate this on their own to a certain extent. So some of the uncertainties include what to call a stepparent, what is the role of stepparent in a child's life, what obligations do stepparents have, what legal rights do stepparents have. Along with that, we can also talk about this just overall lack of clear norms within stepparents, within stepfamily relationships. And the article talked about this idea of a lot of the research has been done on stepfathers versus stepmothers, and this family dance of stepfathers. That stepfathers have to do this careful dance to negotiate their place, both in the life of their partner, but also in their children's lives. They have to try to negotiate how do they interact with the biological father, and how do they make sense of sort of the existing family relationship that exists. Also part of this ambiguity, this lack of institutionalization, is that there's so much variation in stepfamilies, how they're composed, the role that stepparents play, how these relationships came about. And all of this connects back to this idea of there being a lack of clear norms. Another key point in this article is discussion about the stability of second marriages. And just to clarify, by stability, we mean how stable a relationship is, and that is how long is it going to last versus the relationship breaking up. And scholars in this area, you can talk about a second marriage or remarriage, and sometimes we even talk about what number of marriage it is, and so they use the term second and higher order. So that means third, fourth, fifth, etc. And the general research consensus is that second and higher order marriages are less stable. i.e. they're more likely to end in separation and divorce. And some of the reasons why this might be the case is this idea of incomplete institutionalization. It's harder to have a successful relationship when there aren't clear norms, aren't clear guidelines to go through. Another thing is this idea of selectivity. And by this we mean people that to be in a second or higher order marriage, you have already been married. So if you've already been divorced, maybe you're more likely to divorce again. Maybe there's something about you that you're more willing, more accepting of this. Again, this is what the research literature has shown. The other part that could lead to second and higher order marriages being less stable is the role of children in the mix, right? So these second marriages are more likely to have people bringing in children from previous relationships, and that could lead to greater conflict as well. Okay, so this idea of ambiguous status of step-parents, and this is what I asked you to think about for today's reading response as well. And part of this ambiguity, we can think of sort of two categories: ambiguity in U.S. law, but also ambiguity in, it says identify, should be identity, and also the language that we have around this. So in terms of the U.S. law, there's a lot of variation by state in terms of what authority, legal authority, step-parents have. For example, to get custody, or what happens legally if a partnership does end. Is there any responsibility to financially support stepchildren? Or what about inheritance if someone dies without a will? In general, we think that a child can only have two legal parents. So if there's like a third parent in the mix, they need written consent to from daycare providers, from schools, from hospitals to be involved with that. So that step-parent, generally speaking, can only get legal rights if the biological parent gives it up or has their rights terminated. And some of these same conflicts happen for same-sex couples, and there's a lot of variation by the state. In terms of ambiguity by identity or language, scholars talk about this idea of boundary ambiguity. Is this person perceived as a family member? And part of this is trouble with data, right? Or how the data is collected. If you just ask someone, is this person a family member, yes or no, that doesn't necessarily match onto how people really view them, that people sort of think of it on a continuum. Maybe they're a little bit of a family member, but not a full family member. And this is especially true for a former step-parent. So you had someone that was in your life, then there's another divorce. What is the relationship there? Are they still part of your family or not? Are they still part of the extended family? And again, a lot of not really clear norms or guidelines for that. Okay, I'm gonna pause it here and then start another video, just